Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goodman, Director of Marketing and Development for the YMCA of Northwest Louisiana, and we're here for Shreveport-Bossier, my city, my community, my home. My guest today is Madison Poche. Madison,
Hi.
Great to have you.
I'm so honored to be asked to be here. Thank you so much for reaching out.
Absolutely. Well, we'll hop in. We were visiting a little bit off camera, and I learned some great stuff, so we'll keep forging ahead.
Sounds great.
All right.
I'm only a little bit nervous not knowing what the questions are. Trust you.
You'll be great. So my first couple of questions, just to sort of set the stage for who you are, a little bit long, so just hang in there with me. So here we go. Madison, you've been a force in the community. Writer for Heliopolis, former director of admin at SRAC, former project director of the GDIT LED program at BPCC, involved in the Bikeway Pilot Program, a member of the Royal Court of Highland, Highland Restoration Association president, and that's just scratching the surface of all the things you've been involved in. I believe you grew up in New Orleans, received your undergraduate degree from Emory, and a master's in nonprofit administration from LSUS. So let's start here. When and how did you come to live in Shreveport?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you so much for understanding a little bit of who I am. So I moved to Shreveport about 8 years ago for 1 year. I was offered a job that I thought I would really enjoy, and my plan was to come up here, learn a lot about that job, and then head right back down to New Orleans. And kind of the opposite of what I expected happened, where that job didn't work out perfectly, but I really fell in love with this community. And so I kind of started where I was. I was in my 20s and going out downtown and going to different art shows and kind of seeing downtown come back to life a little bit. Like, we got one coffee shop and then we got another coffee shop. It was all really exciting at the time to be a part of. So I emailed the Arts Council asking if they had a job opening, and I wormed my way in to being a part of the arts community and the kind of downtown revitalization at that time, and I've just been sticking around ever since.
And I asked you this off camera, and I'd like you to kind of talk more about it. So what does Shreveport have that New Orleans doesn't have?
Well, I think my short answer was, there's not that much, right? If you're going for a checklist of things that Shreveport versus New Orleans, on paper there may not be as many highlights as we would want, but in my personal experience, one, I just felt very welcomed when I moved here. Right? I got to know the community, and I felt like anytime I would show up in a space, I was excited to be in Shreveport, and people seemed excited that I was excited, and kind of building that network has been really wonderful. And the second part of that is that, like I was telling you, in New Orleans I always felt like a spectator, which was great at times, right? You can go hear great live music, and you can go see an amazing Mardi Gras parade, and you can go walk in a beautiful park. But in Shreveport, I really felt challenged to be a participant. To have a Mardi Gras parade that you want to be in, you might need to be a part of it, right? To walk in the park that you want to see, you might need to send an email to SPAR and let them know what you would like to see in that park. And so I think that is the difference that I find really compelling. Where I was saying, for live music, I've seen a lot of bands and musicians grow, and I have that personal connection and see them succeed and become stronger musicians, right? That's exciting for me. That's a higher quality of experience, right? Is to be a participant. So I really enjoyed that aspect of being in Shreveport.
And a lot of people will go to a parade that doesn't live up to their expectations and be dissatisfied, or go see a live music show and complain because it isn't at the level that they expect. So how do you go from, what do you attribute your perspective or your point of view of being someone who is going to be part of the change and who's going to be willing to actually make the effort and take the time to try and affect?
That's a good question. I think perhaps in my kind of years of getting to know the Shreveport community, I've just felt curious, and I think I've just shown up, right? And if you show up to efforts where people are trying something new, we begin to see a few of the same familiar faces. And if someone is looking for assistance, being able to raise your hand and say, I may not know how to do this, but I'll try it out, has been a great opportunity, right? Like, I've learned a lot, and I've been given a lot of space to learn. And so I don't know if there's a right answer to that, but I think that this city calls for a lot of participation, and really everyone has the opportunity to participate if they're looking around and maybe making a little bit of space, right, for that.
Love it. All right. Well, we're gonna shift for a second to a lot of your focus right now. You are now the executive director of the Highland Center. In the words on the website, a community center in the heart of Shreveport's historic, diverse, and artistic Highland neighborhood. There are a number of different ways in which the Highland Center serves the community. When I looked on your website, it breaks your programs and services into 3 major headings. So talk to me first, if you could, about Highland Center Ministries.
Absolutely. So I might start a little bit further back.
Sure.
So this year is actually the 100th anniversary of the Highland Center facility opening its doors. So it started as Highland Baptist Church, and then in the mid-90s, that congregation merged with First Baptist Church, and they had this big facility. So I think that this organization was kind of ahead of its time, because right now there are a lot of congregations around the country that have had their members move maybe to the suburbs, or their numbers have gone down, but they have these amazing facilities, and they're asking, like, what do we do with all of this space? And so in the mid-90s, the Highland Center was born, and they turned it into a community center. So Volunteers of America ran this space for about 10 years. They had a early childhood education program and their different programs throughout the building. And during that time, I guess in 2010, a smaller congregation, the Church for the Highlands, moved in, and they started working with about 10 or 12 other faith-based groups that wanted to serve the working poor in our neighborhood, but not just do it piecemeal, but collaborate and work together. So it's a pretty amazing and kind of unique effort was formed, where all of these different groups of different faith backgrounds were working together to serve. And so they started doing weekly free meals for the community, free clothing closets, and then different financial services. So now the Highland Center Ministries have been doing this for a decade. We celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Highland Blessing Dinner, the free meal on Thursdays. Clothing closets are back open after closing down for COVID. And then for our financial services, we do the only monthly first-time homebuyers education class in the area, a low-interest loan program that's kind of an alternative to payday lending, and then free tax prep, and we have a few other things, like we have a low-fee ATM at the center. And so this kind of really beautiful collaborative effort helped to bring people together, and it's been serving, off and on for 10, 12 years now.
It's amazing. And I was going to ask you about the financial support services, but you sort of, is there anything else in financial support services that you'd like to share in terms of what's being offered and what you'll find at the Highland Center?
I think those are 3 big categories, but I can talk about them. So I did not realize that there is down payment assistance available for low and middle income people who are interested in buying their first homes. But a lot of those programs require that someone goes through a homebuyer education class. So every single month, we've been doing it for about 10 years now, we have a certified HUD counselor who is offering an 8-hour class on home buying. I wish I had taken that, because there's so many complicated things about taking on a huge loan and understanding your inspection that is not intuitive, but is really a critical piece of our housing puzzle, to make sure that everyone who's credit worthy or could become credit worthy has the opportunity to have an affordable home, right? And then our low interest loan program, we've actually surpassed $200,000 loaned out in pretty small increments to neighbors, and the majority of those loans go to consolidating payday loans. And so, our rate is high at 10%, but we have people who are paying 300% in loans, right? Something that starts out as $200 becomes $800 owed back really quickly. So again, it's a hand up, not a handout. But I think that is a great financial tool that a lot of folks, I hope, learn about and utilize, and fills a gap in the community. And then free tax prep, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And come see us in January and February if you make less than $54,000 per year, and we can help with taxes. And that brings about $500,000 back into our community every year, which is a pretty big investment for some volunteers and a few paid staff working hard for a few months.
It's amazing.
Thanks.
So the third program and service I saw listed on y'all's website, it mentions a number of different ways in which you're a community resource center. Talk to me about that, if you could.
Yeah, thank you. So, I think one big need of our community is social infrastructure. So now I'm going to go off on a tangent, but I was reading about this. There was a big heat wave in Chicago probably 10 or 15 years ago, and during that heat wave, a lot of people, a lot more than average, passed away. And as researchers looked into, who suffered the most, unsurprisingly, they found that low-income minority communities had higher rates of death than other communities. But when they dug in even more, they would find, communities that would have had the same outcomes. They're both lower income, minority, majority. Some of them did better than others. And so they found that communities that had strong social connections, that had social infrastructure, that could turn to their neighbors and say, I'm not feeling quite right, where can I go for help? Those communities did a lot better in those outcomes. So that's all to say that, having some social infrastructure in our neighborhood is really critical. And so, that's just kind of part one. And then, but how do we do that in a way that's meaningful? So one is, we don't have a library in walking distance of our neighborhood. And that's not to give the library a hard time. The library can't be everywhere. But sometimes people just need to be able to print a document, right? And I know during the heart of the COVID pandemic and quarantine, I was working with community college students who were asked to move to learning online, but a lot of folks didn't have a computer in their home, right? Or they weren't able to get online, or they didn't, they needed a little bit more assistance when they were going through a really challenging time to make it to the end of the semester. And so when libraries close and schools close, people were in a really tough spot. A lot of people went through, really difficult times without having those resources available. And I think in the Highland area, because we haven't had a library, or the closest rec center is not in walking distance, we've kind of been having a lot of that same challenge that was really acute during the first few weeks of the quarantine. We've been having a similar version of that over a long period of time. So just a place where people can meet and learn, and kind of get on a computer, right? I know you had Keith here, I haven't watched that yet, but it's estimated that about 2/3 of our neighbors probably don't have PC and broadband connection in their home. That's a really big divide. So we have computers and a printer here, so at least we can begin to start to tackle a little bit of literacy question, a little bit of computer literacy, and then we also just have a big gymnasium that we're making use of. So we have basketball practice and dance class happening all the time, and it's just fun to see people have a safe place to move around and exercise, as I'm sure you guys know here. And then we're also trying to build in, not just have the resource, but to build in training alongside that. So we now have evening HiSET classes, which is the new GDIT. We have computer literacy classes. And
Who's teaching like HiSET? Who's teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's kind of the last piece of the puzzle at the Highland Center is that we're also a nonprofit office center. So we have about a dozen groups that are all working in the building as well, doing their own mission, but all of those missions kind of align to serve our neighborhood. And so right now, Community Renewal International, they have an office in the Highland Center, and they have a staff member who also works at BPCC and teaches the evening HiSET class. And I've pulled in some friends for our computer literacy classes.
And what other organizations are housed or officed at Highland Center?
Thanks for asking. So we have, I'm going to go through the building.
Sure.
Teen Club is through Volunteers of America. They serve high school students after school and during the summertime. Level Up works with 18 to 24-year-olds who have experienced some homelessness or aging out of foster care to make sure that they're in safe, stable housing.
And that's also VOA, Level Up? Okay.
We have Basic Necessities is the diaper bank. We have our clothing closets. Community Renewal is doing evening HiSET classes as well as some arts entrepreneurship classes. We have a licensed professional counselor who's there, and we also have a really interesting immigrant ministry program. I'm trying to think of who I'm missing. I'm so sorry. And of course, the Church for the Highland is there. So what's kind of beautiful about this and what we're trying to continue to build is maybe someone comes in to play a video game, or to get on the computer and print a document, but they might be able to interface with 4 or 5 different organizations that have different services that might help them stabilize and thrive in their life.
It's amazing. And how big is the Highland Center? Like, for people, tell people where it is, and tell people just because it's a very sizable.
It's really big. So first I'll say we're in the heart of the Highland neighborhood, and why I think that is important is I really find this area is so unique, right? It's one of the few areas we have in our region where it's mixed income, right? So about 1 out of 3 neighbors are living in poverty, but we also have a lot of capacity. The highest racial and ethnic diversity index in the region, which means that it's one of the few places where you have a really high likelihood of living next to someone who has a different racial or ethnic background than yourself, right? I think that's kind of a big part of the beloved community, right? Is having diversity in our daily lives. And there's a lot of artists, we have a lot of historic character, so we have a lot of assets, but we also have a lot of work to do. So what I think of as the Highland neighborhood is north of Kings Highway, in between Uri Drive and the interstate. You can kind of imagine that kind of topped by, what is that? I guess it's a river, pretty much. And so the Highland Center is literally in the middle of this neighborhood. So if you drew a 1-mile radius around our building, you would be kind of in walking distance of almost everyone in the neighborhood. And so the building is 150,000 square feet, so that's like 2 YMCAs.
3 almost.
Yeah.
Almost 3 of these.
It's really big.
Yeah.
It's really old. We have a lot of work to do. The building was going to close down 3 years ago, and a big group of supporters got together and not only got the building back, became building managers, but also set out on like year-long neighborhood assessment and strategic plan to make sure that the facility is not just, not blight, but really meeting the needs of neighbors and beginning to kind of chip away at like having a role in reducing intergenerational poverty, right? Which is like our big goal. And so we have big strategic goals and big plans. We want to make sure that we are that hub where people can find, both fun activities to do, social connections, but also the resources that they need to stabilize and thrive.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to move away from Highland Center for a sec. You have your ear to the ground, and as I mentioned earlier, you've been greatly involved since being in this community. From your perspective, what are some of the things that are holding us back?
Ooh, that's a good question. Holding us back from what?
What's that?
Holding us back from what?
Whatever.
So kind of like maybe what does Shreveport need to...
Where do we struggle the
Right.
most? Where do we need the most TLC? Just
Yeah. Okay, I'm also going to answer this question, the long version.
please.
So I really like this model out of Atlanta from a group called Purpose-Built Communities, and they have identified 3 big areas that all need to work together for a neighborhood to be stable. So I tend to think of I don't know what the whole city needs, but maybe if I can work with the neighborhood as a unit of measure, we can make some incremental progress. So their 3 big areas are housing, like cradle to career education, and then well-being. And so I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent, but if I had to start breaking that down, one for housing, I think that Shreveport's in a really unique situation because all these other cities around the country are having an affordable housing crisis. And our crisis is a little bit different, right? Like, we have a lot of housing, but we are missing quality affordable housing. So we just have a lot of adjudicated property that needs to be brought back online. I think we need to continue to invest in the core of the cities to make areas more walkable. So I think if we could begin to chip away at some of the adjudication, blight, maybe landlords that have bought buildings but are just kind of waiting to see if someone else will do the work, we could have a more equitable housing landscape that's really feasible, right? Or hopefully it's feasible. I don't know if it's really feasible. And then part 2 of that is what do you do when you walk outside your house? And so we were talking a little bit earlier about Reform Shreveport and some of the principles that I think they've brought to my attention on walkability, right? We should be able to have a lot more Barksdale Boulevard, where they slowed down traffic, they've got some bike lanes and on-street parking, the sidewalks are comfortable to walk down.
We're talking about East Bank for
East Bank,
those out there. Yeah.
In Bossier. And all of a sudden, all of these businesses have popped up because it's really comfortable to walk between businesses and spend your money and spend a whole evening there, right? And I really think that we could, without doing multi-million-dollar investment, have 10 business corridors that look like that, right? We're also talking about, my dream is to see a slower Kings Highway. We already have 1 lane that's closed all the time, so it's not that different. But like I was saying earlier, that there was a frozen yogurt place across from Centenary College that we think might have closed down. And I think it's closed because it's just not comfortable for students to walk across the street. And so I think we could have a lot more walkable business corridors if we thought a little bit more strategically about how an individual, how a neighbor might approach those businesses rather than how we might drive past them to wherever we're going. Okay, so that's housing. Education, I mean, K-12 is not my lane. I'm sure there are many, many other people who can talk about that. But what I'm excited to say is at the Highland Center, we're working on expanding pre-K or early childhood education program, and then also thinking about workforce development and adult education, starting with GED high sec classes. So, I mean, workforce development, early childhood education, I think those are probably buzzwords for everyone in the city, but that's not my area of expertise. And then well-being, that's probably more for the YMCA's lane. I think one piece of that puzzle, it's not everything, well, I'll say two things. One is when we think about, I guess like what services are we providing and for whom? What I think the Highland Center is able to do or capable of doing is making accessing social services that people need to have a comfortable life, right? To stabilize and move forward, accessible, right? So I'd love to see more nonprofits communicating, having more of a centralized plan for like anti-poverty work. So that's part one. And then two is like, we actually do have a lot that's going well, and we might just need to celebrate it sometimes. And so I think what you're doing here about holding up a mirror to the city, anything that we can do to tell our story and tell it in a positive light, right, is really helpful. Okay, I feel like I went off on a tangent. But I think those are kind of the big areas that we can be working on, and I'll stop there.
No, I love it. And you said something off camera, which I really liked, and I'll just cue you, and hopefully you can go back there. You said something about, if I can just start with my block.
Absolutely.
So talk a little bit about, you did a little bit because you kind of said, let me start with my neighborhood, but let's go even more micro.
No, I think that figuring out what Shreveport needs is so overwhelming. No one really has the full vision. But what we think that everyone can do is walk outside on their block and say, what does this block need to be a better place for people to live? And in Highland, sometimes that looks like figuring, reporting a trash pickup, right? Or making sure that a kid walking to school is not walking past any public health hazards. And I think if we all kind of started there and chose one thing, checking on a neighbor, it becomes a lot easier to tackle the bigger questions when we're starting with the reality, right, that's in front of us. So I'm sure that looks different for everyone, but there's a lot that you can do.
And do you feel like if someone said, do you feel like it's your responsibility to be involved in your community or to make your community better or to give back? Like, how do you kind of think about that or wrap your head around that?
Yeah, when I first moved here, I was doing some work, and I was like, I can't believe everyone's not doing what I'm doing, right? And as I sat back and talked to people, I realized that everyone that I met is doing something really interesting. It might be helping at their church, it might be helping at their school, it might be helping a family member who's struggling, but I think most people are doing I feel like everyone I know is just doing something totally above and beyond, right? And it may not look like standing up and talking at a city council meeting, but we're just surrounded by people who are doing incredible loving work all of the time that I wouldn't be jaded if it doesn't look like it every day, right?
Perfect. All right, so I'm gonna move on to this. Is my final question. We may keep talking, but my last question for you is, what makes you hopeful that we're headed in the right direction?
That's a good question makes me hopeful is, and I think that this is a really collaborative community. It may be because we don't always have that many resources to go around that we're not fighting over them. I'll cut that out later, right? But I think that, a lot of times when I see someone trying something new, our community shows up for it, right? And I think there are a lot of folks are working really hard to move the needle in their area of expertise, right? And there's just so many people who are so dedicated to what they do that every person in my world gives me hope, because not only are they working hard, but we have the opportunity to start connecting more dots in our community. That's the best answer.
And do you feel like, since you've been here 8 years, do you feel like you've seen progress in the 8 years since you've been, do you feel like we're in a better place 8 years later than we were when you first arrived as a community? Do you feel like we're in the same place? Do you feel like we've regressed? Just how do you kind of see the 8-year trajectory since you first arrived?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'll say that my world started kind of around downtown, and it's expanded into Highland. And so, in my smaller perspective, when I was living downtown 8 years ago, it was like, I was walking past a lot of blight, and now, every time I walk to work in Highland or swing through downtown, I see construction, right? Or people who are investing in buildings. So it feels slow sometimes. It's not like, we have like skyscrapers popping up. But I do think that, the pandemic may have slowed, especially I'll say like downtown's momentum. But yeah, I think there are a lot of different pieces that are all coming together, and it can be slow. But if we, left and came back in 5 years, I think we'd be really surprised and hopeful about where we're going and kind of changing some of our perspectives.
Well, Madison, I love having you here. I'm really proud of all the work you're doing. We're lucky you came to Shreveport and have stayed here, and I really look forward to staying in touch, watching everywhere you go, because I think each place you touch is going to be left in a much better place. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely.